All good. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the final presentation of Cycle 2015. We are very happy, honored, privileged, any superlative word you want to use here, to have Dr. David Friedman with us. I can truly say that amongst the luminaries in our movement, his book, The Machinery of Freedom, is one of the most frequently referenced, both positively and negatively. People will love it or hate it, and that's awesome. That's what we need to do, is stir up ideas. And many of the people in the movement who have most influenced me have cited Dr. Friedman's book as most influencing them. So we're very happy to have Dr. David Friedman with us today. David, talk to us about feud is law, please.
Yes. Most people think of law and law enforcement as an inherently governmental activity. We're used to a model where we assume that the law is made by the legislature, or possibly by precedents set by judges appointed by the legislature. That
David, forgive me, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think your screen share was not fully deactivated, because now you're showing as a black screen rather than...
All right, so let me go to screen share. You're right. Yeah. So how do I cancel screen share?
Yes.
Does that do it? Doesn't seem to have done it, has it?
No, I'm still not seeing you. If you click that green thing again, it should unshare it.
There's a cancel down here somewhere. I'm not seeing anything that says unshare. Google
no.
Hangouts, desktop. Is Google Hangouts what I ought to be clicking on? Let me try that.
Okay, never mind. It might be. There we go.
Nope.
Nope, that wasn't it. Okay, you turned it. Okay, so try clicking that green rectangle again and bring it back. Okay. All right. Sorry to interrupt, and I hear from our stagehand that they are seeing you just fine. So
they are.
I'll bow out again and let you carry on.
All right, because I'm seeing you, or at least I'm seeing a wolf figure on my screen, but that's all right. As long as you can see me, fine. We assume that crimes will be detected by government agents called police, that torts are a semi-private system, and that if somebody smashes your car, it's really up to you or your lawyer to show who did it, but then it's tried in a government court and the verdicts are enforced by the government. And I want to talk about a different model of law and law enforcement, and one which historically is actually quite common. In fact, I am going to argue that many, perhaps most, surviving legal systems were built on top of the system I'm describing. And it's a system in which law enforcement is decentralized and in which it's private. And it's a system of law enforcement which in various forms still exists, as well as having been common historically. And finally, I want to argue that in a future very free society, you might revive a modern version of this system. I refer to it as feud law, and that's a little bit misleading for reasons that may become clear in a little bit, but I can't think of a better label. But I should start by saying that the word feud and the word feudal have no connection. They happen to sound similar. But I am not talking about a feudal system. The word feud comes from a different original word and has a different meaning. And the logic of feud law is very simple. And that is that if you wrong me, I threaten to harm you unless you compensate me for the wrong. All right? In order for that to work, there are a number of conditions you have to meet. And the first condition is that my threat to harm you has to be more believable when you really have wronged me than when you haven't. Otherwise, it's just a mechanism for extortion. And I like to refer to that requirement as some way of making right makes might. Some way in which, if I really have been wronged, I will be in a better position to threaten you than if I haven't. Second requirement is some adequate way by which people can commit themselves to carry through on their threats. Because otherwise, you wrong me, I threaten to harm you, you say, well, if you harm me, I'll harm you, and I back down. So you need some way in which people, having made the threat, are then able to commit themselves to carry off on it. third requirement for it to work is some way of protecting the weak, some way in which people who don't themselves have the resources to harm some reasonably powerful person who's wronged them can nonetheless make a viable threat. And finally, you need some way of terminating feuds. Feud systems in practice rarely result in feud. If you look at the real systems, normally you have only one round. That is, you wrong me, I threaten you, you back down and compensate me. But there's no guarantee. And you can imagine a situation where you do something that I think wronged me. I threaten you. You say, no, I did nothing wrong. I harm you. You say, well, look, you've now wronged me, and it goes on. So you need some way in which, if that does happen, you can end that sequence. And if you look at historical feud systems, they have a variety of ways of solving that problem. And let me start with the requirement that right makes might. And I'll start with the feud system that I first discovered, wrote up, I suppose, about 30 years ago, roughly. And that's the legal system of Saga period Iceland. Iceland was settled from Norway about 870 AD. And at least according to the Icelandic account, it was settled by refugees from the unification of Norway. That a man by the name of Harald Harfager, who was king of one of the small kingdoms in Norway, set out to conquer all the others. He succeeded. He imposed a much stronger kind of monarchy than had existed before, and the people who didn't like it left. And quite a lot of them went to Iceland, which had been recently discovered. And they set up a legal and political system on Iceland, which was modeled on the Norwegian system, but they decided that one part of the Norwegian system they could do without was a king. So you ended up with a system in which there was a legislature, there was a body of laws, there was a system of courts, but there was no executive arm of government. All enforcement of verdicts was private. So in that system, when you do something which I believe entitles me to compensation, I sue you in the existing court system. The court system gives a verdict. If the verdict is that you're guilty, it awards a certain amount of money, damages typically, that you owe me. You pay or you don't pay. If you don't pay, I go back to the court and have you outlawed. It is now legal to kill you. It is illegal to protect you. So that's a system in which the ultimate use of force is entirely private, but in which the mechanism for deciding who other people regard as entitled to use force is through a court system and a legal system. And so in that, the reason that right makes might is that if you've really wronged me, I win the law case. My winning the law case tells everybody else in Iceland you're the bad guy and I'm the good guy. It tells your friends they shouldn't support you, because if they do, somebody will sue them and they'll get in trouble again, because it's illegal to defend an outlaw. And therefore, if you try to fight, the coalition against you expands, because anybody who's hurt on my side, his relatives now come in because they have damage claims against you. So that's a fairly formal and elaborate way in which right makes might. Let me now give you a different feud system, a more primitive feud system than the Icelandic, and one that still exists. It's the legal system of the Roman Chal gypsies. Gypsies, as you may know, left northern India about 1,000 years ago. They scattered across the globe, with the result that you now have a bunch of different gypsy communities, each with its own legal system. Which makes it interesting if you're studying legal systems, because they started in the same place and then evolved in different ways. The Roman Chal are the largest gypsy group in modern England. And the Roman Chal system is what I like to describe as a primitive version of the Icelandic legal system of 1,000 years ago. That if I'm a Roman Chal, and I believe you've cheated me, you're another Roman Chal, I threaten to beat you up unless you compensate me. And the reason it works is that both of us know that if you have cheated me, according to the norms of our society, your friends won't back you and my friends will back me. And so the result is that if you've really cheated me, you either compensate me or leave town. So that's a very informal version of the feud system. It's one that depends on a society small enough so that a system of informal norms that people share, and the fact that the other people in the community know more or less what's going on, is enough so that right makes might. So those are two extremes. And now let me give you a third one in the middle, and that's the legal system of northern Somalia, of what was called British Somaliland before the British left. And when I got interested in that one, the first book I read about it was written by a libertarian, a Dutch lawyer who married a Somali woman and spent a good deal of his life in Somalia. And it was then edited by another libertarian. And I'm always a little suspicious of things written by people who agree with me, because I suspect that I will be less critical than I should be. So I looked for other sources, and I discovered that there was a man by the name of Lewis, a retired London School of Economics anthropologist who was the world's leading expert on the legal system of northern Somalia. When I went looking for books on the subject, the first few were written by him, and the next one I found was a Festschrift in his honor written by other people. So I looked at his stuff, and it fit roughly what the other source had, although he knew much more about it. So the Somali system is one in which there are informal court mechanisms. That is to say, there is not an existing system of courts as in Iceland. But when there is a conflict between two people, there are traditional ways of organizing a court to settle it. And then the verdict of that court is going to again affect who supports whom in any future conflicts. So those are all examples. Those are all ones where plain extortion doesn't work, because if you're an Icelander and you just invent offenses, you're going to usually lose the lawsuit, and then you're going to be the loser, not the other person. In the Roman Shah one, the other members of your community probably know if that's what you're doing, and so they won't support you. And in the Somali one, you will probably lose the trial when the trial happens. Let me go on to the commitment mechanism story. How do we make sure that I actually carry through on my threat, given that if I do harm you, you may fight back? And the answer to that story actually goes back farther than our species. That people commonly assert that property rights are an invention of government, and it isn't true. We know it isn't true because property rights in their most primitive form pre-exist the human race. There are quite a lot of species, mostly birds and fish, which are what are referred to as territorial animals. And the way a territorial animal works is that it in some way marks an area that it's claiming, a territory, and it then apparently turns a switch inside its brain such that if another member of its species trespasses on that territory, it will fight. And it will fight more and more desperately the farther into the territory the trespasser comes. That's a commitment mechanism. It's a commitment mechanism hardwired into the biology. The reason it works is that unless the trespasser is much stronger than the defender, a fight to the death is a loss for both parties. So if the trespasser knows that if he keeps coming in, it will be a fight to the death, even if he expects to win, it isn't worth the risk of getting injured, and therefore he backs off. So that's a very, very simple form of property. It's not nearly as elaborate as our form. The property isn't transferable. But it is a case of an individual claiming territory, and what interests me is that the territory is being claimed by a commitment mechanism. Fast forward to humans. And one of the characteristics we observe in humans, which people often think of as irrational, is vengefulness. You hurt me, so I'm going to hurt you in revenge. I want to argue that it's not irrational, that on the contrary, that's our equivalent of the hardwired commitment strategy of territorial animals. That having a psychology such that you will go to a good deal of trouble to get back at somebody who harms you is a good reason why people shouldn't harm you. And therefore, humans have evolved what's in effect a commitment strategy called vengefulness. So that's, as it were, the simplest level of how you commit yourself, an internalized version. But in addition, just a minute, my phone just rang. Hello? Nothing important. In addition, human societies have externalized commitment mechanisms that if you're known to be a wimp, it's tempting to push you around. So it's in my interest to have a commitment, to have a reputation that when people do violate my rights, when somebody does cut wood in my forest, or seduces my daughter, or does various things that an Icelander might do that are illegal in that legal system, which includes writing poems about me, insulting me in Saga period Iceland, I take action. I sue them, and if I win the case and they don't pay, I kill them. I and my friends kill them after they've been outlawed. So we have a incentive to have a reputation for carrying through those threats. And one of the interesting things that you observe in such systems is that not only does that mean that when you wrong me, I have an incentive to carry through on it, it also means that I have an incentive to get a reputation which I might get by enforcing somebody else's rights. So a pattern that you observe both in the Icelandic sagas, but also in accounts of the Comanche Indians, who were another feud system, one we know a fair amount about, is that somebody who is relatively weak has his rights violated. And someone strong volunteers to act on his behalf, volunteers to take on the bully who has violated his rights. Why does he do that? At least partly because by showing that he's even tougher than the bully, he raises his reputation and thus makes people unlikely to wrong him, makes people grateful to him for helping them, and so forth. So one gets mechanisms for commitment. Now, in order for the system to really work well, you need to be able to commit yourself past death. Why do you have to do that? Because otherwise the person who wrongs you will take the precaution of killing you while he's doing it, and then who's to get revenge? And so well-functioning feud systems have mechanisms of one sort or another which are designed to make sure that even if you are dead, the person who wrongs you will end up suffering some kind of damage. And in the Icelandic system, it was very simple, that the normal result of a court case was that you owe damages. The person who's wronged you owes you money. If you're dead, the claim for damage is inherited by your heirs, and they have an incentive both to collect those damages and therefore to carry through on the threat if the person who wronged you isn't willing to pay, and they also have an incentive again to maintain their reputation so that if one of them gets killed, people will know that the rest of the kin, the rest of the relatives will carry through on getting revenge or collecting damages, either way. So that's a way of doing it. Now, the Somali have an interestingly somewhat different system. In Somaliland, you have pre-existing coalitions, what Lewis refers to, I think, as dia-paying groups. Let me go back a little. In Iceland, the damage payment for killing somebody is called weregeld, mangold. In the Bedouin cultures, another feud system I'm not going to talk much about, it's called dia. The people who studied the Somali, I think, were familiar with the Bedouin, so they used the Arabic term dia for damages for injuring or killing someone. A dia-paying group among the Somali is a group of people linked by some combination of kinship and explicit contract, who have agreed that if any one of them is wronged, the others will help him get his revenge or collect damages. They have also agreed that when the damages are collected, they will get a share of those damages. And they have also agreed that if one of their people wrongs somebody, they will help pay the damage payment he owes. So it's a pre-existing coalition, as I say, explicitly formed by contract. Lewis has a comment somewhere in one of his books that one reads about social contracts all the time. And they're all fictional social contracts. Here you have a society with a real social contract, that each dia-paying group, the people have agreed on how they will divide up responsibility, on who gets to collect too much, how much, or has to pay how much under what circumstances, and so forth. So in that system, if I'm dead, the other members of my dia-paying group still have a claim for the damage payment for killing me, and they have an incentive to collect it. So that was a way in which, in that system, you not only can commit yourself while you're alive, you in effect can commit yourself to get revenge even after you're dead. How about protecting the weak? My favorite solution is the Icelandic one. Indeed, I've argued that we should adopt it in our tort system. Because in the Icelandic system, the claim that you had for an injury was marketable property. So imagine I'm an elderly man with one son. Somebody kills my son. In principle, he owes several hundred ounces of silver as damages for killing my son. But if I actually try to go to court and sue him, I'll get beaten up on the way to the court, because I'm a weak old man. I've got no more sons. But my neighbor, he's a wealthy farmer with 4 big tough sons who went a Viking in their youth. So I make a deal with him. I transfer to him the right to collect my 200 ounces of silver. We may agree that if he collects them, I'll get half of it. We may not. That's up to us. It's just a voluntary contract. He now has the claim against the guy who did it. No one's going to beat him up on the way to the court. And so he carries through on the case, collects the money, shares it with me if we've agreed to that. And the result is that although I don't get all of the money, I do get revenged on the person who killed my son, which is a reason not to kill my son in the first place, which is the point of all of these systems, really, is to give people an incentive not to wrong other people. So in the Icelandic system, by making torts marketable, transferable, you had a system in which even weak people could expect to have their rights protected. And I've suggested elsewhere that it would make sense in a modern tort system to make tort claims transferable, because after all, if somebody smashes my car or tortiously injures me or whatever, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know what lawyer will best pursue the case. I may not have the money to pay a lawyer. It's true I could hire a lawyer on a contingency fee where he gets some of the money. But on those terms, I have no way of knowing which lawyer will do the best job. If we adopted the Icelandic system, I just auction off my claim. Whatever law firm is willing to pay the highest price for the right to collect my damages is the one that I want to have it. That's the one that's going to impose the largest cost on the person who injured me and collect the most money from me. So I like to say that in that respect, modern American law is a mere 1,000 years behind the cutting edge of legal technology. The Icelanders did it better 1,000 years ago. The Somali system to protecting the weak is really implied by what I said before, namely that everybody is going to be a member of one of these dia-paying groups, and then he's got a bunch of allies pre-committed to support him if he's injured, even if he's weak. Now, I've oversimplified the Somali system a good deal. If people go to my webpage, I'm currently working on a book on legal systems very different from ours. One of the chapters is on the Somali system, because it's an interesting system, and you can get a more accurate picture than I can give you in a few minutes of a talk. Because part of what's intriguing about the Somali system is that what you really have is not one coalition, but a series of nested coalitions. So you have the sort of smallest level coalition, which is perhaps the descendants of a common great-grandfather, something like that, in the male line. That's a male kinship system mainly. But then if it turns out that we end up with an opponent who's too strong for that, that small group is a part of a larger coalition, which then comes in. And if that's inadequate, it's part of a still larger coalition. So it's like a system of sort of nested Russian dolls, as it were, in which you have a bunch of allies who are probably fairly close relatives, though they don't have to be, and then further allies farther out if needed. So all of these are systems in which you have ways of not only committing yourself, but of getting adequate resources to effectively vindicate your rights. How about ending feuds? What if you have the relatively rare but unpleasant situation where somebody on one side gets killed, the people who did it refuse to pay, so someone on their side gets killed, and back and forth. And that's what people envision when you talk about feuds. The famous American example is the Hatfields and McCoys. It's almost entirely fictional. If you actually read up on the real story of the Hatfield and McCoys, you have one person from one family who is killed in the course of a fight on election day by 3 people of the other. His relatives seize the killers, hold them until their man dies, and then execute them. 4 people dead. That's the last killing that happened in the Hatfield and McCoy feud for something like, I don't remember, 5 years or so. And the feud is revived not by the Hatfields and McCoys, but by the state government, because the Hatfields and McCoys are on opposite sides of a state line. And a sympathetic governor on one side sends bounty hunters illegally, without permission of the other state, into that state to grab the people who are responsible for executing the 3 people. That sets off the feud. Again, there are a few more people killed, and it then terminates. But the story of a long series of killing going back to the Civil War, which you will read about Hatfields and McCoys, is almost entirely the invention of newspaper writers, not of historians. But let me go beyond that. But nonetheless, it's not impossible. There's a famous case in one of the Icelandic sagas where you have 2 women who hate each other, whose husbands are good friends, and one of them is quite a nasty woman. The other is just strong-minded, but not particularly wicked. And the nasty one arranges to have one of the minor people in the other woman's household killed. Her husband promptly pays weregeld to his friend to compensate him, but the friend's wife doesn't regard that as adequate, so she has somebody on the first side killed, and it goes back and forth, and you get about 4 people killed, and the same purse of silver passing back and forth as the 2 husbands maintain their friendship, compensating each other. It's an unusual case, but it can happen. So how do you deal with it? And in the Icelandic case, the way you usually deal with it is by arbitration. So that at some point people say, enough already, we will agree on some neutral party we both trust. That neutral party will say who owes what to whom in order to clean up this mess, and then it's all over. And in the Somali case, as I mentioned, you have courts, ad hoc courts. But my favorite bit reading about the Somali was there was one point when the level of violence between members of 2 different clans got higher than they thought was acceptable. And so the leadership in both groups agreed to raise the weregeld, to raise the diya. You used to have to pay whatever it was, 100 shillings if you killed somebody. Now it's 150. And they, being good economists, realized that if you raised the price of killing people, fewer people would get killed. So, interesting example. All right, let me go on to the claim I made at the beginning, which is that feud systems, rather than being some exotic thing from primitive people, are actually how many legal systems started. And I'll start with ours. That the legal system I live under is Anglo-American common law. Anglo-American common law evolved through a long process from Anglo-Saxon law. Anglo-Saxon law, if you look at it, is essentially the Icelandic feud system with the addition of a king. And the Anglo-Saxon king gets involved in the system because he claims that certain offenses are not only offenses against the victim, but offenses against him too. That if you kill somebody on the public road, that's a violation of the king's peace. So you still owe damages to the relatives of the guy you killed, but you also owe damages to the king. And gradually over time, under the Anglo-Saxons and under the Normans, that approach expands to give you criminal law. As you may know, nobody here, well, no one at least in America, probably nobody listening to this at all, legally speaking, can ever be the victim of a crime. Why do I say that? Because in criminal law, the victim of the crime is always the state. If you look at a criminal case, the criminal case is not Smith versus Jones. It's the state of California versus Jones. The legal position is that a tort case is one in which the victim is the victim, but a criminal case treats the injury to somebody as an injury to the state or to the federal government or to whatever other government, to the crown in the case of in the case of an English case, it'll be Rex versus, or nowadays Regina versus, Queen versus, because all criminal cases are considered state cases. But if you go back to the origins of Anglo-Saxon, origins of Anglo-American common law and Anglo-Saxon law, that's a feud system. Let me give you a different example, which I came across when I was working on this book on legal systems. What I think is the best recorded legal system in human history is Jewish law, rabbinic law. We've got a, I think, 800-page in modern translation text, the Mishnah from about 200 AD, and increasingly additional documentation since then. If you look at rabbinic law, you see what I like to refer to as fossilized feud. That in rabbinic law, if you kill somebody, you are supposed to go to one of the cities of refuge. This law assumes the kingdom of Israel still exists, even though for most of the period of rabbinic law, the kingdom of Israel is no longer around. But the legal theorists never let that bother them. So in theory, you kill somebody, you go to one of the cities of refuge. You're escorted from the city of refuge to a court in the city where you killed someone. The court decides whether it is what we would think of as first-degree murder or not. Whether it was intentional is their criterion. If it was intentional, you're supposed to be executed. But you are to be executed by the avenger of blood. Who is the avenger of blood? The heir of the person you killed. That is to say, the avenger of blood is the person who would have been responsible for pursuing feud in a feud system. If the court rules that that the killing was unintentional, that it was not first-degree murder, you are supposed to be escorted back to the city of refuge for a period of indefinite length before you can come home again. If the avenger of blood catches you on the way to the city of refuge, he can kill you. So that looks an awful lot like what's left of a pre-existing feud system. I could go on into other versions. Well, let me take Islamic law as probably the clearest one, because in Islamic law, people talk about Sharia, but that's really a mistake. Sharia is God's law, and it's enforced by God from the Muslim standpoint. What the Islamic law enforced by courts is fiqh, jurisprudence, which is the human attempt to figure out what God wants us to do. In Sunni Islam, there are 4 mutually orthodox schools of law. They disagree on the details because they know that they don't know for sure what God wants. That's a digression. If you're interested in Islamic law, which is another interesting system, I've got a chapter on that in my book draft, which you can get from my webpage as well. But in Islamic law, killing or injuring is a subset of the law called jinayat. And in that, the victim is treated not as the state and not mainly as God, but rather as the person you injured or the heirs of the person you killed. And the normal result in jinayat is that if what you did was the equivalent of first-degree murder, the heirs are entitled to retaliate. They're entitled to kill you. They don't have to. They have the option of collecting diya, of collecting a fixed damage payment for killing somebody. If it was not first-degree murder, and those are not exact terms, but not their equivalent of first-degree murder, the heirs can't retaliate, but they still get to collect damages, to collect diya. And if it was an injury short of murder, then the victim gets to collect damages depending on the amount of the injury. So again, it looks very much like a pre-existing Bedouin feud system that Muhammad incorporated into his legal system by having courts to decide what happened, but ultimately treating it as a claim by the victim or the victim's heirs against the offender, a claim that could be compensated for by a payment in camels in Bedouin law, as it happens. I think there's some evidence that Roman law also started out with the feud system. I've got a chapter in someone else's book on that. It's not clear because we don't have very good information about very, very early Roman law. But I think it's at least arguable. So I think it looks as though a lot of systems started out with feud systems. It's sort of the natural decentralized system. They worked out ways of meeting the requirements for a feud system to work, and then later somebody built on top of that what we think of as a modern legal system. Let me go on to say a little bit about the relevance of this to modern libertarians, aside from the fact that it's just intellectually interesting to see how other societies have created and enforced law in the past. Because I wrote a book a little over 40 years ago, in which one section was an attempt to describe what a modern society with private property and without government might look like, what people now sometimes refer to as an anarcho-capitalist system. And I was really making it up. I was trying to figure out how it might work. And many years later, when I studied all of these odd legal systems, I concluded that I had reinvented the wheel. That what I had been creating in The Machinery of Freedom Part 3, which was the section that had my version of private anarcho-capitalist system, was essentially a modern version of a feud system. So let me say a few words about that, and for people who are curious, I assume we're putting up somewhere the URL. I've got a PDF of the second edition of Machinery of Freedom on my webpage that you can download for free. The third edition has got about another 100 pages and a beautiful cover, I might mention. So if people want that, you have to pay for it, but it's not very expensive. It's up either as a printed version on Amazon or as an ebook also on Amazon. But the second edition will show you, will tell you about my version of a stateless society, as does the first edition, which is harder to get. The third edition has a bunch of additional stuff. But in any case, the system I sketched there works as follows. Each individual is the customer of a private firm that enforces his rights, rights enforcement agency. Each pair of such firms realizes that there may be conflicts between their customers, that violence is expensive and unreliable, and so each pair of such firms agrees on a private court. And they agree that if there's a dispute between their customers, the private court will settle the dispute, and they will then go along with the verdict. Now, there is no government in this system. So what enforces the agreement? And what enforces the agreement is that there are repeat players, that each enforcement agency knows that if when it loses the court case, it refuses to go along, the other agency won't go along when it loses. The result will be that every conflict ends up with people shooting each other. It's very expensive to hire people to risk their lives. It's not a very reliable way of enforcing your right because the right guy might lose. So both of them have an incentive to keep their agreement and to abide by the agreement, to accept whatever the arbitration agency they've agreed on chooses. And then where does the law come from? The law is now being produced on the market, that each private court, each private arbitration agency has a set of legal rules which determine how it will settle disputes. It has an incentive to try to design the rules that the rights enforcement agencies want so that it can get their business. The rights enforcement agencies have an incentive to try to use a private court that has rules that its customers like living under, because that way they get customers. Whereas in a democratic system, the individual voter knows that his vote has almost no effect on the laws he lives under or anything else in the government, because there are millions of voters. In the system I'm describing, just as in an ordinary market, the individual customer decides what he gets by who he buys from. So that if I find that my neighbor's rights enforcement agency has better rules, or their cops show up faster when there's a burglary, I can always switch to them. And that means it is in my interest to have at least some reasonable idea of which agencies do a good job and select accordingly. Whereas it is not in my private interest to know whether Republicans or Democrats do a better job, because I have no control. I have one vote out of whatever it is, 50 million or 100, no more than that. One vote out of 100 million or so in deciding that. So I know that I might as well vote for the guy I like, or the guy who looks nice, or the guy who's a good demagogue and makes me feel good, rather than finding out who's actually doing a good job. All right, so that's a very, very brief sketch of how you might have a modern society which, like the societies I've been describing, had private, decentralized law enforcement. There are a number of potential problems with that system, which I've discussed in machinery. One of them is the stability problem, the risk that the agencies might get together and reinvent government with them as the government. How likely that is depends on how many agencies there are. If you end up with only 2 or 3 rights enforcement agencies in the current territory of the U.S., it's quite likely that they will decide to form a cartel and stop letting people switch agencies. If there are 100 or 200, if a couple of them try to do that, their customers leave and hire someone else to protect them. And in fact, in the Icelandic case, the Icelandic system lasted for about 1/3 of a millennium, for about 330 years roughly. It eventually broke down. And one possible explanation of the breakdown is that at the end of the period, you had gotten, in effect, the equivalent of their arrangements had become more and more concentrated. So that, again, I haven't gone into details on how the Icelandic system works, so I better leave that for your reading the chapter on the Icelandic system machinery, which describes it. But in any case, one can interpret that as breaking down ultimately because there were too few of the equivalent of rights enforcement agencies, and therefore too much potential for one of them trying to take over. The other serious problem is how you defend against nations in the system I've described, because even though protecting me is a private good, the agency, if I don't pay the agency, they don't protect me, protecting us is a public good in the sense that it's very hard to only shoot down missiles that are aimed at your customers. So that raises problems, and in the first edition of Machinery I have one chapter discussing that, and in the new 3rd edition I have another chapter. But again, that would take us way beyond what we're now doing. So I think I've spent about as long as I'm supposed to be spending on my half of this, and I gather we can now go to questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. There was quite a bit of dialogue here on the simultaneous chat for the viewers, and I put out a request for questions, but off the top of my head, it occurs to me, and maybe I missed something, but when you say the Icelandic system worked for 300 plus years, could you define worked? I mean, all of this theorizing based on these systems is important if, like, people actually could carry on a normal life. You talk about Somalia, people are scared of that. You talk about medieval Iceland, nobody knows what that means.
Yeah, you don't have good mortality figures for 1,000 years ago. There was one scholar who, the Icelandic sagas, the violence in the Icelandic sagas tends to be very small scale. It tends to be on the level of, you know, Bjorn was killed and Helgi was hurt, kind of thing, not 100 people on each side until the end. And you end up in the final 50 years of breakdown, you end up with a couple of battles in which you have maybe 100 people killed. But earlier than that, it's almost all very small scale. And someone did try to go through the sagas describing the period of breakdown and count bodies. And it looks as though when things were going very badly, the death rate from violence was roughly comparable to the U.S. highway death rate. The way I like to put it, and I don't want to overstate this, so we don't have good data on this sort of stuff, is that England, Norway, and Normandy probably lost a larger fraction of their population to violence in 3 weeks of the year 1066 than Iceland did in 50 years of civil war, which is what essentially the Stirling period, the final period of breakdown, is really a sort of a de facto civil war, as various factions are trying to make themselves rulers of Iceland. It ends up with Norway taking over Iceland at the very end. So that's some evidence. The Somali case, I don't really have good information on the system when it was working, but you have to realize that the present violence is our fault, not their fault. That what happened in Somalia was that Somalia was more or less under the control of England in the north and Italy in the south, British Somaliland and whatever the Italian area was set up. When they pulled out, they created a nation of Somalia as a centralized democratic system, something Somalia had never had, was not at all a part of their traditions. That lasted for about 6 years, ending in a coup by a guy called Barre, who made himself military dictator. Barre then got into a war with Ethiopia, which was the traditional enemy of the Somalis. And the Soviet Union, which had been supporting Barre, switched sides and supported the Ethiopians. The war at that point went very badly. Barre got assassinated. The system then broke back down to more or less traditional system, at which point the UN and the US came in. And we said, look, the Somalia needs a government. After all, we can't have a place without a government. Ever since then, various people around Mogadishu, having observed that if you're going to have a government, it's better to be governor than governed, have been fighting over who will be the government. And anytime anything stable happens, we use Ethiopian troops, which is mostly what we've been using there, to smash what's happened or to try to install the people we decide to approve of. So if you look at I think you can find a link if you go to my chapter on Somalia. I think I have a link to a piece by Lewis, by the academic who's an expert on it. And his view very clearly is that the current violence is the fault of the US, the UN, and Ethiopia, not of the Somali. In northern Somalia, they have set up what they call the Republic of Somaliland, which is a more or less functioning, very minimal kind of state based mostly on traditional institutions, but nobody will recognize it. Because if we recognize the Republic of Somaliland, we would have to admit Somalia wasn't one country, and we insist on making Somalia one country, which it hasn't been in the past, no reason for it to be in the future. So in the case of Somalia, I don't really have good data on how violent it was or wasn't back before the nation of Somalia was created. We have a good deal of information on how the system worked, but whether it killed few people or many people, I don't think we know. We know that that whole area, the Horn of Africa, which includes Somalia and Ethiopia, is the kind of place where every adult male carries an AK-47. So it's not a very peaceful kind of area. But it's not at all clear that Somalia did worse than other parts of that. And I have seen some stuff suggesting that in places where they weren't fighting, the Somali without a state were doing pretty well for themselves in recent decades. But again, I don't really know enough, so I would want to make any very strong claim. But the Icelandic system, it worked in the sense that you had a functioning society for a very long period of time, that it looks as though most of the time most people weren't killing each other. Now, the Icelandic case also worked in another sense, which may or may not be credited to the institutions, and that is we get our word saga from a body of histories and historical novels that were written down in Iceland in the 13th and 14th century, possibly composed several hundred years earlier and passed down in oral tradition, we aren't sure. Iceland had a population of something like 60,000 people. It's the size of a not very big suburb. There are probably 10 or 12 of the Icelandic sagas currently in print in English translation. So if you think of a society from a cultural standpoint, Saga period Iceland is in the same class as Periclean Athens or Elizabethan England. That is to say, it is a society which produced for its size an incredible amount of stuff we still find worth reading. So if you're curious about that, my favorite saga is Egil's Saga. An Egilssaga is the story of 3 generations of a family fighting a family feud with another family who happened to be kings of Norway. That Egil's grandfather, father, and then Egil, who the saga is mostly about, are in effect fighting a feud with Harald Harfager and his sons. Doing pretty well on the whole.
Wow.
So
we have
it's quite fun.
Sorry, we have a couple of specific questions here. Not much time left. If you don't mind. One viewer wants to know if there's a place in your system or a feud as justice for prisons.
That's an interesting question. The Icelandic, I don't think either the Icelandic or the Somali system had prisons. And in fact, prisons are less normal a part of legal systems than we usually assume, in part because they're expensive. We live in a very rich society, historically speaking. But if you look, one of the other systems that I discuss in my book that I've written about is 18th century English criminal law. Because 18th century England, on paper, the legal system was our legal system. It's where we got it from. But there were no police or public prosecutors. So that, in fact, criminal law was treated the way we treat tort law. If someone stole your horse, it was up to you to figure out who did it and to prove it to a court. Except that, unlike tort law, you didn't collect any damages. So one of the interesting questions is why it was worth people enforcing criminal law. But that was a system in which the only function of prisons for any serious offense was to hold people until they were tried. That in 18th century law, on paper, the only punishment for serious offense was capital, was execution. And in practice, if you committed a capital offense, you probably didn't hang. You probably got pardoned on condition of agreeing to be transported to be a indentured servant, a 14-year slave in the New World, or agreeing to enlist in the army if there was a war on and they needed soldiers or sailors, or once in a while pardoned and sent home. So it was a system in which they did not start using prisons as a form of punishment until somewhere around the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. And I think my explanation for that is just they're expensive. That you've got to feed people. In principle, you can try to use slave labor, but it didn't work very well when they tried it, and therefore it made more sense to do other things. So, but in a modern system, I could imagine having prisons. I don't know if you would or not. It's not like I can describe how future institutions will work. I'm trying to sketch what I know about them, and that's all I can do. Prisons pretty inefficient punishment. It makes more sense to collect a fine if you can. I've got some discussions elsewhere of some disadvantages of that. The problem with fines is you have an incentive to collect them even if the guy isn't guilty, so you have to worry about over-enforcement. That's the problem of civil forfeiture in the modern system, that the police have an incentive to claim that you did something illegal so they can seize your property, whether or not you really did. And that problem would exist in a private system as well. So, but the real answer is I don't know. But the systems I'm describing, I don't believe either of them used prisons. The closest thing to a prison in the Icelandic system was that if you had received what was referred to as the lesser outlawry, that meant you were allowed to leave Iceland, and in 3 years you could return, and it was no longer legal to kill you. So it was a sort of a temporary outlawry. And if you got that, and it was winter when no ships were leaving, you were entitled to be in any of a small number of places near your own household while you were waiting for the winter to be over so you could leave Iceland and go to Norway. So you can think of that as a sort of imprisonment, but not in an actual prison.
Okay, well, we actually have a couple more questions, but we're out of time here. So if you wouldn't mind, Dr. Friedman, I will send them to you in an email, and maybe we can get a couple more brief answers.
Sure.
If you don't mind me. All right. But very stimulating, very thought-provoking. I have never heard a defense of vengeance before. I'm going to have to ponder that one thoroughly. And I'm sure other people will be scratching their heads and thinking a long time about what you've shared with us tonight. So thank you very much. Greatly appreciated, sir.
Happy to have been of use. Bye-bye.
You have a good day.